In this lecture on the challenges and opportunities for governance in complex systems, Dr. Oren Young first focuses on the role of institutions and governance systems as mechanisms for steering individual and social behavior to reach shared goals. He notes that one role for governance systems is to address specific problems identified by society, and he emphasizes that collective action problems are one type of problem that requires institutions to redirect individual actions that, when aggregated, could cause or exacerbate social and environmental problems. He highlights the challenges posed by complex systems and uncertainty within them, using examples from the global climate agreements and other environmental governance systems that use different approaches to induce change or steer individual behavior. Spatial and membership mismatches often challenge the ability of these governance systems to reach the desired goal, and he notes that as the need for coordinated global action on managing human impacts on the environment increases, we will need to explore new dimensions and connections among governance systems. He concludes by noting that complex problems require institutions that are agile and adaptive to changing information and understanding of the system.
This talk has two parts. The first part is to talk a little bit about governance and what we mean by governance and the general kind of community of people who think about governance and how they approach questions of governance. And the second part of the talk really focuses on what we in the community call the problem of fit, which has to do with the compatibility between the character of this biophysical and socioeconomic systems involved and the governance systems we create to govern them, to address, to solve problems that arise in those systems. I actually really only have one big take-home message that I want to communicate this afternoon, and that is that we now seem to be confronted with an increasing number of problems of governance for which our standard governance practices, our repertoire of governance practices, don't seem to fit very well. And so we're increasingly sort of confronted with the question of how do we expand our toolkit? How do we expand our repertoire of governance practices to address the kinds of problems that are increasingly confronted, like climate change, but others as well. And my thought is to kind of leave you in this presentation with a sense of the problem, and then to talk a little bit in the shorter presentation tomorrow about some of the places we may look for solutions. So I'm hoping that sort of overnight you'll be kind of worried about the problem and say, what are we going to do? And that I can come back tomorrow and say, well, here are some of the things we're thinking about that you guys might want to think about also as you go forward with your work. So, okay, the first part of the talk. I think most of you know that the focus of my work over a very long period of time has been on governance, where we think of governance as a social function that has to do with steering or guidance. Governance and governance systems then are social institutions which perform this function more or less well. And so we're looking at situations where there's a need in a society for steering mechanisms and trying to think about what kinds of steering mechanisms might be most useful and how these steering mechanisms can be created and implemented and made as effective as possible. There are a variety of ways of sort of thinking about the question of the need for steering and steering mechanisms, but in my work I've mostly approached this question by from a sort of problem perspective, a problem focus. I say, is there a problem that society needs to address, and then let's think about governance in the context of that problem. We can think about problems either in quite abstract and theoretical terms, or we can think about them in very focused and concrete terms. So a lot of us who think about these questions theoretically come out of a background of thinking about things like collective action problems. Collective action problems are problems in which the individuals have incentives to behave in ways that seem rational or sensible from an individual point of view, but which produce collectively undesirable results if everybody behaves in that way. The tragedy of the commons, of course, is a classic example where individually understandable, in certain sense, individually rational behavior produces a collective problem. And we could think about climate change in the same way. Another kind of collective action problem is what we think of theoretically as the free rider problem. And most of you are probably familiar with the free rider problem, where it would be desirable to have a public or collective good produced, but it would be even better if it gets produced and I don't have to pay for it. If I can benefit from society's production of the good, but I can be a free rider. I don't have to pay my taxes, for example. But of course, if everybody thinks that way, nothing happens. The problem doesn't get solved. You can also think about the problems from a problem perspective in much more concrete terms. And so we have a problem of stratospheric ozone depletion. We have a problem of increased concentration of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. We have a problem of marine pollution. We have a problem of dead zones in the coastal areas. We have a problem of sea ice melting in the Arctic ocean basin, and so forth and so on. And I like to kind of work both sides of that street. I like to think in kind of theoretical terms. In earlier life, came out of a background with an interest in things like game theory and other kinds of collective action models. But I also like to think about this in concrete terms, because the average policymaker or the average individual doesn't think too much about game theoretic models, but thinks a lot about what to do about ozone depletion or climate change and so on. And so once we have a sense of a problem, then we think in terms of the institutional arrangement, the governance system. We often call these environmental or resource regimes that we create to deal with the problem. So we talk about fisheries management, wildlife management, climate management, and so on. But the really important thing to bear in mind is that the central problem is to guide or steer the behavior of the human beings. It's not that we have to manage the fish, or we have to manage the wildlife. I mean, yes, that's something we hope will be an outcome, but fundamentally, we don't create institutional arrangements for the fish to follow or the game to follow. The problem is to create mechanisms to steer the behavior of human beings. And so I think this sometimes is a kind of a terminological deceptiveness about fisheries management, wildlife management, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we look at these regimes, these governance systems that we create, we're interested in the following sort of suite of conceptual or analytic questions. We're interested in the question of the creation of governance systems, which may not be by design. I mean, it may be that these are things that evolve or emerge as a result of the behavior of many people. Today, we more and more think in design terms. We think, can we create an effective agreement in Paris to deal with climate, or can we build on the Montreal Protocol? But creation, how do these governance systems, these mechanisms for steering, come into existence? How are they created? And how then, secondly, are they implemented? How do we move, we say, from paper to practice? Okay, we agreed on December 12th to the Paris Agreement. How do we take that agreement and move it from paper to practice? In the Paris Agreement, the US made a pledge. This is what are called intended nationally determined contributions. And the US said, we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025 relative to what they were as in the baseline year of 2005. Well, that's nice. The president is certainly committed to this, but can we do it? Maybe yes, maybe no. But we know that the key mechanism that the president is using is something called the Clean Power Plan. And he has, through executive authority, had EPA issue a set of regulations to implement the Clean Power Plan, the key to our Paris Agreement pledge. And 27 states have brought lawsuits against the regulations, saying that they are in excess, that the president has acted beyond his constitutional authority in issuing these regulations, that there is no legislative, there's no legal mandate sufficient to justify his actions. And so this now will go to the courts, and the US Supreme Court has said that they have made a decision to suspend the implementation of EPA's regulations for the Clean Power Plan until the legal issues are fully resolved. That means that nothing has to happen until the legal issues are fully resolved. It's a very fascinating issue because this decision on the part of the Supreme Court was the last major decision that was made before the death of Justice Scalia. You get the point that implementation can be a big deal when it comes to the question of the effect of the role of these sort of steering mechanisms. And then the next thing that we spend a lot of time on is trying to understand the performance of these governance mechanisms, these regimes that we create. And this turns out to be a really challenging issue because we live in a world of complex causality. Almost everything involves sort of multiple causal forces that are at work in these systems, and teasing out how much of what happens, how much of the reduction in the use of CFCs and halons can be persuasively attributed to the Montreal Protocol turns out to be a very challenging, methodologically challenging issue. And so a lot of the, if any of you are interested in getting into this scam, a lot of the effort that's made in the research community is to come up with methodological techniques that will allow us to get some sense of the proportion of the variance in relevant outcomes that we can attribute to the operation, the existence and the operation of these institutional mechanisms. And then, of course, we're also interested in the evolution of these mechanisms over time. I mean, steering mechanisms, regimes don't stay constant once you create them. They evolve in all kinds of directions. In some cases, the evolution is a pattern of going from strength to strength. So if you look at the ozone regime, we started with the Montreal Protocol in 1987, which had fairly modest requirements in terms of behavioral change, and has progressed through a series of amendments over time into a more covering a wider range of chemicals. It's almost 100 chemicals now that are covered, and moving from reductions to phase out completely. The current issue with the Montreal Protocol is hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, which are a fascinating problem because actually HFCs are not ozone-depleting substances as defined in the Montreal Protocol, but they're very powerful greenhouse gases. And so we're in the midst of a process of trying to determine whether or not the Montreal Protocol can be used not only as a way of solving the stratospheric ozone problem, but as a way of helping to address the climate problem. And in fact, far more greenhouse gases emissions have been reduced under the Montreal Protocol than under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the Montreal Protocol is the best climate policy that we've developed so far. So let me press on. So when we're thinking about performance, of course, there's a multiplicity of criteria that we can use to think about performance. It's not just, did it work? Did it solve the problem? But we also want to know things, depending upon what discipline you come out of. You may want to know something about sustainability in the biophysical sense. You may want to say, okay, we're creating a regime to manage fish stocks. Will it contribute significantly to long-term stability of the relevant stocks in purely sort of biophysical sense? But we also may want to think about questions of efficiency if we're coming from an economics background. Are we solving this problem in the most cost-effective manner that we could do so? Is there another mechanism that we could use that would be more efficient, more cost-effective? This is one of among the big debates in the climate change community is what are the pros and cons of different policy instruments? And for example, would we be better off with a cap and trade kind of system, or would we be better off with a straight taxation system? And this is a very sort of large debate that goes on, particularly among environmental economists. But we also may want to know something about equity. I mean, to what extent are the outcomes, the results, in conformance with our concepts, our principles, our criteria of equity, of who gets what? And this is where, if you are coming from my original discipline in the late Pleistocene of political science, people are very much interested in who gets what, and to what extent is the distribution, the distributive results compatible with various standards of equity or fairness. And also we're interested in, coming to what Steve was talking about this morning, of resilience. I mean, are these governance systems, are these steering mechanisms resilient? Can they cope with more or less significant changes in the systems that they are trying to steer? And so for a long time we created these steering mechanisms thinking, well, we just focus on the steering mechanism, but then we realize, hey, the world is full of fairly dynamic, in some cases quite, think about fish stocks. It's one thing to control harvesting by human beings, but there are lots of other factors at work that may make the fish stocks highly variable and dynamic. So, for example, I've just come back from spending a week in the Faroe Islands, and one of the big issues there is this extraordinary development over the last 10 years of the North Atlantic mackerel stock. The North Atlantic mackerel stock used to be a phenomenon largely of Norwegian coastal waters. Now it has spread westward to the Faroes, to Iceland, and even to Greenland. And it is, by biomass, the biggest fish stock of the North Atlantic Ocean today. This has all happened within the last 8-10 years. Where is this system going? Independent of the kind of management system or the steering mechanisms, is this building up to a crash? Or is it something that has longer-term prospects? And so the resilience of governance systems in the face of highly dynamic biophysical systems is another sort of consideration. So just to finish off on the first part of this presentation, in my own applied work, and I've tried to work both sides of the street, doing both kind of theoretical work on how do we understand the concept or the criterion of effectiveness, for example, and how do we deal with current issues. My own applied work has largely been on large-scale systems, as you can probably tell from the comments I've been making so far. I had a very, very long-running and very enjoyable and stimulating relationship with Eleanor Ostrom, because as you probably know, or most of you probably know, her empirical sort of bed of information is largely on small-scale systems. And she did, if you think about IFRI and other kinds of projects, looking at fairly small-scale, community-level kinds of ranges. I'm looking at often global systems, and Eleanor and I had an ongoing conversation for 20 years every time we get together about the issue of scale. Steve will appreciate this. You know, what, in terms of our understanding of things like the creation or the effectiveness or the evolution of governance systems, what kinds of findings scale up or scale down? And to what extent are the findings that Eleanor was coming up with on small-scale systems also transferable to large-scale systems and vice versa? And of course, like any good conversation, that didn't have any end. But it was a permanent sort of, you know, what have you learned recently? What have you thought recently about this question? But my own work has largely been in three large-scale domains, so to say, as problem areas. One has been with atmospheric issues, and I've done a lot of work on the ozone question, stratospheric ozone. I've been, over the recent years, done a lot of work on the climate issue, and somewhat less work on some other issues like persistent organic pollutants, for example, which turns out to be a big issue in some parts of the world where I have a strong, long-standing interest. I've done quite a lot of work over the years on marine issues on a fairly large scale, especially on fisheries kinds of questions. I noticed that some of you were talking earlier on, I can't remember when, about the Magnuson-Stevens Act. So I was very much interested in this question when that legislation was passed in 1976. And was then called the Fishery Conservation and Management Act because we hadn't yet tagged on these labels of Magnuson and Stevens. But there are all kinds of interesting questions about the mechanisms that we were going to use. And would these things called the regional fisheries management councils really work? And who was going to determine the membership of those? So if you look carefully at legislation, it says they will be recommended by the governors of the relevant states and confirmed by the Secretary of Commerce. Secretary of Commerce deals with fish, right? And there's an interesting question. So I got very involved in fisheries law enforcement because this is now covering the exclusive economic zones of the United States, which are vast. And so the question is, and we didn't have the kinds of satellites we have now at that time, 1976. And so law enforcement was the responsibility of the U.S. Coast Guard. And as you probably know, there's not that much love lost between the U.S. Coast Guard and the National Marine Fisheries Service. The Coast Guard is located in a different, in fact, it's moved around from different agencies. It's now part of the Department of Homeland Security. Sounds like a great basis for dealing with fisheries law enforcement, doesn't it? So I've spent time on Coast Guard ships sort of observing very directly the fisheries law enforcement because we're interested in implementation, not just what this regime was going to look like on paper, but how was this actually going to work? And it's pretty interesting to participate I did this mainly in the Bering Sea. Even in summer, it's a pretty rough place, and boarding fishing vessels in the Bering Sea is pretty tricky. It certainly gives you something other than a purely theoretical perspective on the issue. But now we have things like automatic identification systems from satellites, and that's another really interesting project. I'm involved in a project sponsored by the Japanese, looking at the role of satellite technology in solving large-scale environmental problems, and to what extent can we use satellites to address these kinds of issues. And it's pretty interesting stuff. And then finally, in my sort of applied work, I've also done a lot on the polar regions. Years and years ago, 40 years ago, for reasons I won't bore you with, I got involved in Arctic work, and about every 10 years or so, I think, well, I'm going to get out of this Arctic stuff. I'm going to think about something else, and it never works. And so I'm still up to my ears, and the Arctic is interesting in part because it's experiencing such dramatic biophysical change. As you probably know, the impact of climate change is being felt in the high latitudes, especially in the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere, far more dramatically than more or less anywhere else on the planet. And so we have not only sea ice melting, we have what's happening to the Greenland ice cap, and we have permafrost melting and so on. And you probably know that there's an extraordinary amount of CO2 and methane locked up in the permafrost and in methane clathrates under the water. And how stable are they? And should we be worrying about the potential I deal with these sort of big, scary issues. The Greenland ice sheet, the Greenland ice sheet is very likely to have passed a tipping point where its destruction is a done deal. The only question is, how long will it take? And most people think probably a couple of 100 years, which is long enough for most of us to say, oh, well. But on the other hand, the Greenland ice sheet has, if it were to melt entirely, would raise the global sea level by about 7 meters. So think about Miami in those terms, or think about Bangladesh in those terms. Well, okay, so enough in general terms. So I want to spend the rest of the time here on this question of what I call, or what most of us in this line of work call the problem of fit. And there are some very simple, let me give you some simple examples just to sort of cement the concept, the issue which we're addressing in people's minds. So there's questions of spatial fit or spatial mismatches. So suppose you're interested in the governance of migratory bird populations. And the bird populations migrate over relatively long distances and in and out of multiple jurisdictions. If you create a governance system, if the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service creates a governance system to deal with brant geese in the Bering, in the far north, it won't get that on a dime will get you a cup of coffee in terms of solving the problem, because what happens if those who are making policy decisions in other jurisdictions don't get with the program? And when you consider that, I told you I would do a lot of work in the Arctic, but a lot of migratory species summer in the Arctic, and they are likely, depending upon what part of the Arctic it is, to end up in southern China, Australia, or in North Africa, or if there are Arctic terns, they will fly from the Arctic to the Antarctic. So they go from the Arctic summer to the Antarctic summer. So in cases like this, spatial match, spatial compatibility is a big issue. Then, of course, there are membership matches, membership mismatches. So you think of something like the Kyoto Protocol, which we negotiated in 1997. The commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the first commitment period applied only to so-called Annex I countries, and Annex I countries are essentially, think the OECD. I mean, they're the developed countries of the world. But in the meantime, China, for example, has become, by a large measure, the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. China now accounts for, depending upon how you calculate, 27 or 28% of global greenhouse gas emissions. India is well behind, but is still in the top 4 and rising fairly rapidly. China now has greenhouse gas emissions which are roughly equivalent, even per capita, to European levels. Of course, we still lead the pack in per capita emissions by a large measure, so we're still the bad guys by far. But still, the question is, if you want to make serious progress on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you need to find ways to draw in players such as the Chinese and the Indians and so on. And of course, that's part of what we've been trying to do with respect to the negotiation of the Paris Agreement. But this is a fit problem, or a match or a mismatch problem. Then there are what I, for lack of a better term, call formula or allocation matches and mismatches. So we have in the United States an interstate compact that governs the allocation of water from the Colorado River. Goes back to the 1920s. We had very laboriously negotiated because it includes whatever it is, 8 or 10 states. And the Colorado Compact allocates the water among user states, state by state, in terms of acre feet. And this seemed okay at the time, but guess what? This turned out to be a really lousy allocation mechanism. Why? Because the river flow in the Colorado River is very variable. And it turns out that the allocation agreement was negotiated during a time of relatively high flow. And so the Colorado today simply doesn't have enough water to meet the allocations that the different states believe they are entitled to under the terms of this agreement. And so instead of doing something like a percentage formula, which we now do in some fisheries allocation systems, where you say, well, we're going to set the TAC, the total allowable catch, and then we're going to allocate percentages, which the recipients don't like, because they say, oh, well, that's going to make it very hard for us to plan, because we don't know exactly how many acre feet we're going to get or how many fish we're going to get, and how do we plan our investment strategies over a period of years with that degree of uncertainty. But on the other hand, if the resource itself is that variable, then if you have a serious mismatch problem if you've allocated the resource during an unusual time of abundance or high flow. So there are plenty of examples of successes of human systems in creating steering mechanisms or governance systems which are fairly well matched to the biophysical and socioeconomic circumstances. So if those of you who are familiar with Eleanor's work, someone is here from Bloomington, but most of you probably know of Eleanor's work. She and her colleagues were able to identify a fairly large number of cases of communities that managed to develop governance systems that were fairly well matched to the circumstances at hand. But it's pretty easy to exaggerate that, even in small-scale systems. I mean, those of us who've worked in different parts of the world know that it's easy to find. I mean, there's a kind of as some anthropologists said, the myth of the ecological Indian. You know, we have this kind of idea that, oh, you know, the indigenous peoples live close to nature, and we're very good at kind of adapting their social practices. And yes, sometimes, but there are also lots of cases where they didn't. And in fact, lots of cases where even fairly large civilizations ended up being kaput, because, in part at least, partly because of natural phenomena like droughts, but partly because of bad steering mechanisms. So there are successes, but there are also failures. And it's also the case that there are some fairly striking successes even with large-scale systems. There's some tendency to say, oh, well, you know, small-scale traditional local communities, they're pretty good at sort of solving the problem of fit. But on a global scale, we can't do it. There's no sense of community. There's great diversity. There's conflict. There's this and that, and high degree of uncertainty. But there are actually success stories on a large scale. So, for example, the multi-nation European system that deals with the management of water in the Rhine River over the last 30 years or so has actually led to a very marked increase in the water quality in the Rhine River. You can swim in the Rhine River now, safely, which nobody in 1975 would have imagined that you could do. So this is a success story. The Antarctic treaty system has so far been quite a striking success story. I mean, it sets aside the continent of Antarctica for peaceful and scientific purposes, and it explicitly prohibits the development of mining activities, at least for 50 years, until sometime in the 2040s, and it's working pretty well. I won't go into the details, but and I mentioned the Montreal Protocol. Ozone is sort of our gold standard case. So a lot of time is spent on trying to figure out, hey, what went right in those cases? How did they solve the problem of fit or match? Now, let me take the next few minutes to sort of say something about the take-home message. So what I want to argue is that we are moving on a planetary scale toward a situation in which the problem of fit is taking on new dimensions, new scope, as we move into the anthropocene, as we move deeper into the anthropocene, into human-dominated systems. And I think there are a number of dimensions to what makes the conditions, the problems that we're confronting today increasingly challenging from a point of view of fit. And let me just mention 3 or 4. And one has come up already this morning, and it's the problem of connectivity. And the connectivity on a number of dimensions. And first of all, and most obviously perhaps, is globalization. So we're now operating in a global system where even if you are a small community in rural Africa somewhere, you are likely to be impacted more or less dramatically by global processes, global issues. Another is that we're now dealing more and more with human-dominated systems. I mean, you know, the kind of Vatuzek et al. Sort of perspective on these things. And so we can't really just say, let's hold the human components of the system off to the side, hold it constant for a moment, and look at the biophysical part of it. We really have to look at coupled systems. This is no news to you guys here at Succinct. And one that I'm thinking quite a lot about these days is, and it came up this morning, is the whole question of teleconnections. So if you are sitting in the Arctic and you're noticing that there is a remarkably high level of POPs showing up in human tissue among residents of remote communities, and you say, well, these guys aren't using a lot of persistent organic pollutants. Where is this coming from? Well, they're coming through airborne and waterborne transmission systems, usually from long distances away where they're produced and discarded. And they are coming into the high latitudes where they tend to last for a long time because of cold conditions and where they bioaccumulate. And so if you are now a resident of a native community and you're eating seals, for example, who are eating fish, who are eating smaller plankton and so on, the persistent organic pollutants bioaccumulate. And so some of the worst health impacts of POPs are found among people in Arctic communities. It's a teleconnection. The same thing is true with respect to melting sea ice. I mean, the Arctic, believe me, is not responsible for very many of the greenhouse gas emissions that are going into the atmosphere. And yet, as I said, the Arctic is experiencing greenhouse gas global change more rapidly than anywhere else on the planet. And it's because of things that are happening elsewhere. But then there are these feedback mechanisms. So what happens when sea ice melts? You get a much darker surface because the surface of the water is darker than the surface of the ice. And so it absorbs more solar radiation. So now we've got increased solar radiation in the system. And I could go on with other kinds of examples. I mean, the melting of the snowpack in the Himalayas may very well have dramatically disruptive effects on the South and Southeast Asian monsoon system. And by some expectations could reduce crop production in India by 30%. I think of the consequences of that. So connectivity is one. Nonlinearity is another big one, where you have, we've talked about this, sort of thresholds and often fairly abrupt changes. You guys know about that. But let me talk a little bit for a minute or two. It'll take just 5 more minutes to finish up here, about a question of, because I think this really goes to something I hope we can discuss perhaps tomorrow, is directionality. I mean, a lot of us think very much these days about what I think many people in the community call, people like Tim Lenton and Martin Scheffer and so on call bifurcations as opposed to oscillations. So an oscillating system is one that, I mean, it doesn't return perfectly to its prior condition, but it has some tendency to, with some time lag, to revert to prior conditions. Think of, El Nino as an oscillating, ENSO as an oscillating system. But bifurcations don't. I mean, they put us into a different world. And it seems that especially when we're talking about complex socio-ecological systems, bifurcations seem to be typical or characteristic. And what I want to raise, and here's at this point just a question, is what does this mean for thinking in terms of adaptive cycles, like Steve explained to us this morning? Are there some problems with the adaptive cycle sort of analytic vision of the world when we are experiencing bifurcations on a large scale? I'd sort of like to talk about that. And then we also talk a lot about emergent properties and the frequency of surprise. I mean, things happen in social systems, in biophysical systems that they constantly take us by surprise, and they seem to happen all the more so in socio-ecological systems that take us by surprise. And so to kind of wrap up here, what this means, I think, from the point of view of governance and steering mechanisms is that there is an increasing and more compelling need for systems that are agile and nimble, and that can respond fairly easily and quickly to changing circumstances, changing demands. That you want to avoid, to the extent possible, lock-in effects that make it. I mean, this is a big fit problem. We have problems, needs that call for agile and nimble systems, but where we create steering systems or governance mechanisms that are hard and difficult to change. This is where I want to leave this discussion this afternoon and pick it up again tomorrow, is that our kind of dominant perspective, our kind of dominant way of thinking about governance in much of the modern Western literature is focused around regulatory mechanisms and the sense that we need to negotiate legally binding agreements, and we need to create these systems which are sufficiently entrenched and powerful so that they don't get sort of knocked out of place quickly and easily. And the idea that legally binding, well-entrenched systems are somehow a requirement to be effective in terms of influencing the direction of the behavior of the relevant actors. But the problem is that these legally binding entrenched regulatory systems are often not very agile. We create systems because we think this is what's necessary for implementation, for compliance. We do a lot of thinking about compliance and the importance of having legally binding mechanisms to elicit high levels of compliance. And it turns out that we then find ourselves with a world of systems which are not very well adapted, in which there's a problem of fit in relationship to some of the, not all, but some of the most important problems that we are now facing. And so my thought is to leave this here in terms of this presentation, but to say in the short presentation tomorrow, in case you get anxiety ridden about this overnight, I've got some thoughts about avenues to pursue to address the kind of problems of fit that are more and more front and center in our thinking as we try to come to terms with the sort of the world of the Anthropocene. So in fact, that's I'll put a plug in here for my forthcoming book, which is called Governing Complex Systems, Sustainability in the Anthropocene. And with that, I'll finish.